Hi AP. Okay, so let's take out our voice leading root position review sheets. This is the 7-page packet. And let's look at number 1, okay? The rule is in bold print, okay? When connecting triads whose roots are a second apart, you need to move all the upper voices to the nearest chord tone in contrary motion to the bass. It's very important. So if you look here at all these examples, the bass is moving up by a second in the first one, so I'm going to have to move my tenor, alto, and soprano down. Second one, the bass moves down, so the other upper voices will be moving up. The third one, the bass moves up by a second, so all the other voices will go down to the nearest chord tone, and so on and so forth. It's really important that you remember this, otherwise you're going to run into voice leading errors. I'll show you with the first one. So, this is what I've done. I needed to move the tenor down to the nearest chord tone, the alto down to the nearest chord tone, and the soprano down to the nearest chord tone because the bass moved up by a second. And if you remember that rule, you can't go wrong. It's a rule that you simply have to memorize. It's very, very important. You're not always going to have it in writing next to you, some part writing examples that you have to supply. Okay, so here's how to do it incorrectly. Let's say I forgot about that rule. And instead of this chord that I have done here, I have an A in the bass. And let's say I switched the alto and the tenor, like so. Can you identify the mistake in part writing? If you compare the first chord here with this chord here, well, hopefully you realized that because I didn't follow this rule, I've now created parallel fifths, which are forbidden. Okay, so it's really, really important that you remember that. So hopefully, moving forward, you can check your work and see how you did. You also want to go back and check that all the voices are within an octave, the upper voices. Also to make sure that you've doubled the correct tone. There should be 2 roots, 1/3 and 1/5. I did this without spelling out my triad underneath. If you need to do that, I suppose you can, but the goal is to not do that anymore and just to visualize it. If the bass has an E, then the triad's EBG. If the bass has an F, then we have to build FAC, and so on and so forth. I could go back and I can also do something like this. You might be asked a question to look at the chord progression and supply a key and a Roman numeral analysis that would work diatonically in that key. So for example, the first one, let me just erase all this. You can look at these 2 chords, identify the triad tones, and we have a G, B, D chord, so that could be 5 in the key of C major, moving to an ACE chord, which could be a 6, minor 6 in the key of C major. What else could it be? Well, let's suppose that GBD is the root. That means I'm in the key of G with a capital 1 chord, and the root can move from 1 to 2, couldn't it? So you want to be aware of things like that as well. Okay, so check your work and see how you did. Make sure that the upper 3 voices are moving in contrary motion to the bass to the nearest chord tone. Okay, notice in the last example here, I needed to include this B flat. Why? Because I've got to double the root. So if the root is a B flat, then I must have a flat sign, so the tenors are doubling the root and singing B flat. Some of us in our packets maybe forgot to do that, so it's very, very important that you remember that. If you remember this rule, then you really shouldn't run into any problems regarding parallel fifths, parallel octaves, parallel unisons between voice parts. Let's check out number 2. Okay, what we needed to do was notate the intervals between the voices in the following example, and then put an X by the voices that demonstrate incorrect parallel motion. Okay, so here's our first chord. The first example is done for us. Well, let's look at A. We have to look at the bass and tenor in the first chord, a G to a B. That's a major third. In the second chord, the bass and the tenor have a minor third. That's acceptable motion, acceptable parallel motion. You are allowed to move by thirds. Okay, in the second one, let's take a look at it. And let me use my red marker. So we have to compare the bass and the alto in the first chord. Bass to alto, G to a D, that's a P5. In the second chord, bass to alto, I have an A to an E, that's a P5. I needed to put an X here because that is incorrect parallel motion. We cannot have perfect parallel fifths. Okay, in the next one, let's look at C. We have the bass and the soprano that we have to compare in the first chord. Bass to soprano. They're singing G's, so that's P8. In the next chord, A to A, that's also a P8. That gets an X because that is also incorrect parallel motion. Let's examine D, tenor and alto in the first chord. So here's tenor up to alto. B to D, that's a minor third. C to E is a major third. Minor third to major third in the same voices, acceptable. Next, let's take a look at E, tenor and soprano. Tenor, B, soprano, G. That's a minor sixth. Tenor to soprano, C to A, that's a major sixth. Sixths are fine. And last but not least, let's look at F, which is our alto and soprano. In the first chord, that's a P4. In the second chord, alto and soprano, that's a P4. All right, so you want to limit yourself to P4s. Occasionally you want to do them. They're allowed and acceptable. In this case, they don't break any part writing laws. So I put a X here in parentheses. If you left it blank, that would be fine as well. Okay, it's really the perfect fifths, the perfect unisons, the perfect octaves that must be avoided at all costs. So that's how we would do that section. So let's go back and shift down to the next part. This is 3A, page 2. What voices move in incorrect parallel motion in the example below? What is the incorrect interval by which they move? Well, you have to examine each voice part carefully, right? And you can see that I've chosen the bass and soprano after careful examination. E to an E, F to an F. And that is parallel octaves. So that is forbidden. Incorrect parallel motion. So hopefully you were able to figure that out. What you really have to do is go through each voice part, similar to what we kind of did in this example up here. Number 4, write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. They want you to use closed structure for all chords. Okay? They were kind enough to supply a note, so hopefully you change that as I did. Okay, we're looking at a C right here in the soprano, not a B. It was notated incorrectly. So we're in F major. That's our key. F's in the bass. So hopefully you got the Roman numeral analysis correct. Okay, notice we have 2 1 chords in measure 1, so we might want to change that up instead of it being static motion, because that's boring. to the 5 chord 2 times in the second measure, ending with the 1 chord. Okay, so closed structure, there's really only one way we can do this. FAC, those are the nearest chord tones in the upper voices. Closed structure, CAF. Double check to make sure that you don't have any perfect parallel unisons, parallel fifths, parallel octaves. It all looks good there. Second measure, 5 chord. Spell it, CEG. Oh, I should mention, go back and make sure that you've doubled the root in the first measure. So you should see the F twice in both chords, which it's there. Same thing here, you want to double the root, so double the C. Okay, C is doubled in the soprano, and closed structure. Bring it down to the nearest chord tone. Done. Here, also closed structure. The C is doubled by the tenor here. And the last chord, we have the root. The root's doubled, the third, and the fifth. And if you look at each voice part, they're really moving very nicely. It's smooth singing to the vocalist, and that's the whole idea here. Number 5, okay, they want open structure. Okay, and now I'm in the key of E minor. I have an F sharp in the key signature also. And so I can spell my triads, EGB, ACE, BDF. Oops, wait a second. It's got to be D sharp because of the figured bass sign. Another BDF, I should say D sharp, F sharp. That doesn't have to be in the figured bass because we have a key signature, but you have to notate F sharps. Okay, and then our 1 chord, back to EGB. Open structure is leaving a chord tone in between the upper voices, which we have done right there. Okay, also this motion right here, the bass is moving by that of a fifth. So when that happens, you'll recall that there's one common tone that can be left in the same voice. In this case, the soprano is staying on the same note. And the other voices are moving to the nearest chord tone, and it's even better that they're moving in contrary motion to the bass. That's beautiful part writing. From the 4 chord to the 5 chord, okay, here's where we have our bass moving by a second. So what does that mean? From the earlier we discussed that if the bass moves up by a second, then the upper 3 voices should move in contrary motion to avoid any part writing errors. And there's the case. And I've got the B doubled right here by the tenor. I've supplied my fifth. Do I have to write an F sharp here? No, I don't, because guess what? I have a key signature. But I do need to include the sharp sign by this third, because that's what my figured bass tells me I need to do. So that's a major 5 chord. That's why it's capital 5. Same thing here, capital. So here we've gone from static motion and made it a little bit more interesting because we've got 2 5 chords in a row. We changed things up a bit. And we're going from the 5 chord to the 1 chord right here. So the bass is moving up. And notice the other voices that are moving down. So hopefully you did okay with this and you're getting a better handle on voice leading. (5A). What irregularity occurs in the 2nd chord? Let's look here. Hopefully you saw that the 3rd is doubled. The triad in the 2nd chord is FAC. I only see one, the triad here is ACE. And I only see one A, but I see 2 Cs. Why is that? Well, remember the rule that when the bass moves by the interval of a second, occasionally you're going to have to double the third in the second chord to avoid certain intervals. And so that's what you see there. When the bass moves up a second, one voice may move in parallel thirds with the bass, and that's going to result in the doubled third. This was in the packet that you had, but more towards the end. So the second chord will have a doubled third. So which example below demonstrates the above principle? So we have to look for a doubled third in the second chord. So let's see. So here's an F in the bass, so a third above an F would be an A. So let's compare bass with alto. Bass with alto. So there's our third, or our 10th, depending on how we want to look at it. And here is not so much a third or a 10th. That looks like it's an 8th. So it's not going to be A. Let's look at B. So bass is C, so we need to find where the E is to make it our third. Okay, so we're comparing bass with tenor. And here is our third, and there is our 8th. So it's not going to be B. In the third letter C, let's look for those parallel thirds. From the bass to the alto, looks like a third, E to G, and then an F to an A. So there's another third. So there's where our parallel thirds are. And as a result, you can see that in this measure right here, from our FAC triad, the A, the third, is doubled. Okay? It's really important to remember that rule. So hopefully you did okay with that. Let's go on to 6A. Write the soprano, alto, and tenor voices for the second chord in each case. Be sure that the third is doubled in the second chord. Let's write our triads in. DFA, EGB, GBD, ACE, CEG, DFA. The bass moves up by a second, so I have to find where my thirds are between the bass and soprano. Bass and soprano. So the soprano is going to sing a G rather than sing an E. So there is my third, doubled by the soprano, with one root and 1/5. In the second measure here, we have GBD, where is our third or our 10th, bass and soprano, G to B. So now in the second chord, we'll make the 10th between the same voices, A to C. And the other voices move in contrary motion down from the bass, which is moving up. And we've completed the chord with one root, 2 thirds, and 1/5. In the next example, we have a C major triad, CEG. The bass is moving up by that of a second. Let's find where our parallel thirds are. C to E, D to F. So notice I've doubled the third by having the soprano and alto sing the same note. And the bass is moving up by that of a second, so that means that the soprano voice will come down and the tenor voice will come down to the nearest chord tone. For 6B, they want you to write the soprano, alto, and tenor voices for the second chord in each case. Again, doubling the third in the second chord. Let's build our triads. B flat, D, F. C, E flat, G. why E flat? Notice my figured bass. E, G sharp, B, why G sharp? Notice my figured bass. F, A, C. D, F sharp, A, why F sharp? Notice my figured bass. E flat, G, B flat, why B flat? Notice my figured bass. So now, in all of these triads that I'm boxing, we need to make sure that we double the third. Let's go with blue. So I'll take my blue pen and I'm going to figure out that the bass moves up by that of a second in all three examples. So now I want to go back to the first chord and compare the bass with the voice that has the third above the bass. That's the soprano. So we're going to go B flat to D from bass to soprano, moving on over to C to E flat. We're keeping the thirds in the same two voices. When we do that, we're going to have a doubled third, which is the whole idea here. So I've got 1 root, 1/5, and there's my 2/3. Okay. In the next chord, we have E, G sharp, B. The bass is moving up by an interval of a second. Let's find out where the parallel 10th is. E to G sharp, looks like it's between bass and alto. F to A. And then the soprano and alto will double the third. There's my root, there's my 5th, and there's my third times 2. In the last chord, D, F sharp, A. D is in the bass, it moves up by that of a second. Find the parallel thirds. It's between bass and alto. D to F sharp. Therefore, I'm going to keep it in the same two voices, bass and alto. E flat to G. After that, I can slide down the tenor to the nearest chord tone as the soprano. Now I want to go back and I want to make sure that I've adhered to my figured bass symbols. So in the first chord, I must put a flat sign. Okay, next to the third. What's the third in this triad? Well, it's the E, so that's why I have a flat sign here for E flat. Very important. In this one, I need to make sure I have a G sharp, which is supplied for us. In the last measure, I need to make sure I have a flat 5. So I need a B flat, so don't forget to put your flat sign here. Very important. So that's where we were going with 6B. Let's move on to number 7. This is page 4. When progressing from a 5 to a 6 chord in harmonic minor, the second chord will usually contain a doubled third, and this is to avoid the augmented second. You never want to have a voice part sing the interval of an augmented second. So now we have to write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis, keeping in mind that we want to double the third in the final chord. So, A minor. A, C, E is the minor 1 chord. D, F, A is the minor 4 chord. Back to the minor 1 chord. Looks like we have a major 5 because it's harmonic minor. The sharp here in the figured bass tells us to raise the third. That indicates that we're using harmonic minor. To the major 6th chord. Remember, the 6th chord is major in a minor key. So, the first chord, it looks as if it's an open spacing, so chances are we're going to have a lot of open spacing here. Because if we go open, close, then we're going to be dealing with a lot of leaps. Just keep that in mind as well. So, in the first chord, is the root doubled? Yes, it is. Nice open spacing here. Going from the 1 chord to the 4 chord. Okay, the bass is moving by that of a 4th or a 5th, depending on how you look at it. So, retain the common tone in the same voice, in this case the tenor. And then move the other chord tones to the nearest. available pitch that fits within the 4 chord. In this case, up a step. I can't bring this alto down to sing a D because then I would have 3 roots. So it has to go up. Now I'm going from the 4 chord back to the 1 chord. Let's keep the common tone in the same voice. There's 1 common tone. And I can move back down to my voices there. Now I have a 1 chord to a 5 chord. So the bass is moving by the interval of a fifth, which means I'll have 1 common tone. You have to memorize that. Keep the common tone in the same voice, in this case the alto, and move the other voices to the nearest chord tone. Contrary motion works best if possible. And here it is. My root is doubled. Now, here's where things get a bit tricky. I'm in harmonic minor, and I've got to go from a 5 chord to a 6 chord. That means you don't want to run into the augmented second. So here's how I did it. I found where my third is. It's from bass to tenor. I'll show you with a different color so you can see. It's from bass to tenor, right there. So I'm going to keep it in the same voice and go over here. Okay, so in this last chord, I'm not going to have the root doubled. I'm going to double the third. So the tenor really must sing this A from the G sharp. In other words, I can't have the tenor sing the F with the bass because that's my augmented second that I'm trying to avoid. We don't want that. So the tenor must travel up. That's why we're going in thirds here, to avoid that interval. Once that happens, and I've got 1 root, 1 third, here's my other third given to us in the soprano. The only tone that's missing is the 5th for the altos to sing. So hopefully you did okay with that and you're beginning to understand a little bit more about it. Number 8, okay, we also have irregular doubling. We're in a minor key, chances are G harmonic minor, and right away I see a figured bass, meaning to raise the third, so yes, we're in G harmonic minor. And we're going to supply the Roman numeral analysis for this. Okay, so here I've got a 1 chord, G, B flat, D, to a 5 chord, major 5, that's D, F sharp, A. Here's to my major 6 chord, E flat, G, B flat, to my major 5, D, F sharp, A, back to my minor 1, which is G, B flat, D. Okay. Look at the bass first, before you do anything else. The bass is moving by an interval of a fourth. What does that mean? That means there'll be 1 common tone. What's the common tone between the 1 chord and the 4 chord? In this particular example, looks to be a D. Keep the D in the same voice, in this case the tenor. Move the other voices to the nearest chord tone. If you do that, then you'll have 2 roots, a third, and a 5th. Here we're in minor, and we're going from the 5 chord to the 6 chord. So the bass is moving by a second. What does that mean? If we're going from the 5 chord to the 6 chord in minor, that means we have to look for where our parallel 10th is going to be, our parallel thirds, and keep it in the same voice to avoid the augmented second. So let me break out my green to show you that the bass and the alto are singing the 10th or the third, which means in the next chord, the bass and the alto will be singing that same interval. Therefore, I have to double the third with the soprano with the alto. So the soprano and alto will both be singing the third there. And then the only chord tone that's missing would then be my tenor. I can put in the B flat right there. Okay, what I cannot do, and I'll show you with my, let's do orange. What I cannot do is put an E here in the alto. That would make sense because I'm doubling the root, but this interval right here, the F sharp to the E, that's an A2, and that's not allowed. And that's the whole point of doubling the third in this chord, is to avoid that interval of the augmented second. Now, once that irregularity in doubling occurs, the very next chord you're going to pick up with normal doubling, okay? So now, in the next chord, let's go back to blue. I'm going from the 6th chord back to the 5 chord. So the bass moves down by the interval of a second. So normal doubling, that means simply that if the bass moves down by a second, I should move the other voices in contrary motion to the bass to the nearest chord tone. Okay, in this particular case, I had to move the soprano or the alto down from the G to the F sharp. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a third, and the third is very important because that gives us the quality. My root is doubled, my root is doubled. Remember normal, go back to normal procedure here. And there's my 5th. Finally, going from the 5 chord to the 1 chord, there should be one common tone. Keep it in the same voice, in this case tenor, and move all the other voices to the nearest chord tone. And that's how you would do that example. Next, when connecting triads whose roots are a third apart, retain 2 common tones and move the remaining voice to the nearest chord tone. So, look at the first example. Right here, bass moves by a third. You'll have 2 common tones. Retain them in the same voice. Bass moves by a third. Bass moves by a third. Figure out your triads. Figure out your common tones. You might even want to highlight them or underline them or something. Those 2 are common. Those 2 are common. So you want to keep the common ones in the same voices. And my G and my B are common. So hopefully you did okay with this section. Common tone, same voice. Common tone, same voice. Common tone. Common tone. Common tone. Common tone. Check to see that in every chord here your root is doubled, which it should be. Root, root, 2 roots. Root, 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 root. Done. Moving on. This is page 5. Write the soprano, alto, and tenor voices for the 2nd chord in each case. Be sure to retain 2 common tones in the same voice. Bass moves by a third. You'll have 2 common tones. Memorize that principle. Keep it in the same voice. Make sure you have 2 roots. Let's look at number 10. For number 10, write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. We're in the key of F major. Let's spell our triads. Why B flat? Because we have a key signature. Roman numerals. We have a major 1 chord going to the minor 6 chord. Minor 6 to a major 4. Major 4 to a major 5. Major 5 to a major 1. Look at the motion of the bass and then decide what to do. In the first measure, bass moves by the interval of a third. Keep 2 common tones in the same voice. In this case, right here, soprano and alto. Move the other chord tone to the nearest one. Going from the minor 6 to the major 4 chord, the bass is moving by the interval of a what? You guessed it, a third. So, that means I'll have 2 common tones. Keep them in the same voice. Going from the 4 chord to the 5 chord, the bass is moving up by a second. What does that mean? If the bass is moving up by a second, I'm in a major key. I could go down to the nearest chord tone in contrary motion to the bass, as I've done here. From the 5 chord to the 1 chord, the bass is moving by the interval of a 4th or a 5th, depending on how you look at it. Okay? So here what you would want to do is keep the common tone in the same voice, but we can't, because of the given soprano line. But all is well. I've got a root, a third, and a fifth. I followed all of my voice leading rules and principles. And the last thing you want to do probably is go back and just double check that you have 2 roots, 1/3 and 1/5 in all the chords. So I'm highlighting my roots as I did before. Let's move on. Number 11, write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. Here we have to be careful because we're in a minor key, and once you figure out the Roman numeral analysis, you'll realize that we're going from a 5 chord to a 6 chord. So we're going to have irregularity in doubling to avoid the augmented second interval later on in this. So, how do you measure up? Check it out. The 1 chord to the 6 chord. The bass moves down by the interval of a third. Retain 2 common tones in the same voice. Hopefully, with me explaining this to you, it's getting a little bit easier to memorize the easiest and the most effective ways of part writing to avoid any conflicts. If the bass moves down by a third or up by a third, retain the 2 common tones in the same voice and move the other voice to the nearest chord tone. In the next one, we're going from the major 6 to the minor 4. Again, the bass is moving by a third, which means you'll have some common tones. How many? 2. Keep them in the same voice. In the next chord, look carefully at the way the bass moves by the interval of a second. All is good so far. The bass is moving up by a second. What's the rule? That means that I should bring the other voices down to the nearest chord tone in contrary motion to the bass, as I've done. Why the G sharp? Because the figured bass sharp sign alone means to raise the third above the bass. Now I've got a 5 chord, major 5 chord to a major 6 chord. So in this example, in the last measure, what have I doubled? I've doubled the third. Right here in the tenor voice. Why can't the tenors sing an F, because the G sharp down to an F would be our augmented second, which is not allowed. So that's why we have to double the third there. And if you look carefully, right here and right here, that's my parallel third motion. That's allowed. That parallel third motion is allowed in order to avoid the augmented second. And as a result, you have a doubled third. So that in the last measure, what you see then is 1 root, 2 thirds, and the fifth. In 11a, write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. I'm in the key of D major. First things first, identify the triads. Then provide the Roman numerals. I'm going from the 1 chord to the 3 chord, so my bass is moving by a motion of a third. From the 2nd chord to the 3rd chord, my bass is moving by the motion of a second. From the 3rd chord to the 4th chord, my bass is moving by the motion of a third. The last 2 chords, I'm going from a 2 to a 5 chord. The bass is moving by that interval of a fourth. Now I can go back. Remember my rules to avoid part writing mistakes. If the bass is traveling by the interval of a third, retain 2 common tones in the same voice and move the next one down or up to the nearest chord tone. 3 chord to the 4 chord, the bass moves by a second. What does that mean? That means you're going to have no common tones. So in that particular case, you're going to move all the other voice parts ideally in contrary motion to the bass. So the bass is moving up by a second, so my tenor can come down to the nearest chord tone, as can my alto and soprano. From the 4 chord to the 2 chord, the bass moves by the interval of a third. Retain the common tones in the same voice, move the other one to the nearest chord tone to complete the triad. And from my 2 chord to my 5 chord, the bass moves by that of a fourth. You'll have 1 common tone that can be retained, in this case in the tenor, and move the other voice parts to the nearest chord tone. Go back, double check that you have doubled the root in all of these chords, and that your third is present and your fifth is present. And there you have it. Let's move on to page 6, number 12. Learn this principle when the bass moves up a third, as in the case here. One voice may move in parallel thirds or tenths with the bass, resulting in a doubled third in the 2nd chord. We practiced this earlier, and it's really important that you follow this rule when you're in harmonic minor and you're going from a 5 chord to a 6 chord to avoid that augmented second interval. But know that this can happen in other situations as well, and it is acceptable, okay? So, bass moves up by that of a third. Let's find where the parallel tenths are, or the parallel thirds are in each chord. So we'll always compare it with the bass. So find the parallel third with the bass. It's in the soprano. C to E, moving to an E to a G. Okay, in the next chord, we have an E to a G, moving to a D, and then an F. Next chord, D to F, going from an F to an A. So I'm just bracketing my parallel tenths, or my parallel thirds. Next one, next measure, G to B, B to D. Spell your triads. F sharp, notice the sharp 5 in the figured bass. So now I'll go back, and I realize that in the second chord, I'm going to need to double the third. So I'm just going to add that in. So I know in this case I need 2 Gs. In the second chord, in the second measure, I'll need to double the A and have 2/3. In the last measure, in the second chord, I will need to double the third, which is the D. So I'll have one, in the second chord of each measure, I'll have 1 root, 2/3, and 1/5. So you still want to try your best to retain the common tones in the same voices. In this case, tenor can stay. Second measure, tenor can stay. Third measure, alto can stay. And then simply figure out what chord tone you're missing to complete the triad so that you have a root, 1 root, 2/3, and 1/5. Root, third, 5th. Root, third, the second chord, my apologies. Root, third, 5th. For 12A, write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. Okay? Hopefully you changed the note in measure 2. Soprano note should read an F, not an E, as they originally had it. Here, in this particular example, we have a key, and we're supposed to supply the Roman numeral analysis as well. Spell your triads first. Okay. Make sure you have a doubled root in all these. And notice the change in motion. It's not static motion between voice parts. It changes it up a little bit, which makes it more interesting to sing and to hear. Root, third, root, 5th, root, 5th, root, third. Again, the voices are not leaping more than a third in this particular case. It's smooth, and it works. From the 1 chord to the 4 chord, the bass is moving by that of a 4th. Retain the common tone in the same voice. Move the other voices to the nearest chord tone. The 4 chord to the 5 chord, the bass is moving up by that of a 2nd. That means you'll have no common tones. If the bass moves up by a 2nd, move all the other voice parts down in contrary motion to the bass, to the nearest chord tone. From the 5 chord to the 1 chord, the bass moves by that of a 5th. You'll have 1 common tone. Retain the common tone in the same voice, and move the other voice parts to the nearest chord tone to complete the triad. Number 13, write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. E minor. What jumps out right away? This sharp sign, probably harmonic minor. Figure out your triads. Minor 1. Next chord, major 6. Next chord, minor 4. Next chord, note the figured bass. Note the F sharp that's in the key signature. That's a major 5. Next chord, C, E, G, major 6th. Right now, an alarm is sounding because I'm in minor and I'm going from a 5 chord to a 6 chord. A major 5 chord to a major 6 chord. Hopefully you're thinking what I'm thinking. That in this chord, I'm going to need to double the third to avoid the augmented second. I want to make a note of that. Then we can go back and we can simply look at our bass motion. E to a C, the interval of a third. Retain two common tones in the same voice. Complete the triad. Soprano can double the root then. 6 chord to a 4 chord. The bass moves by that of a third. Retain the two common voices. Move the other voice to the nearest chord tone. 4 chord to the 5 chord. The bass moves up by that of a second. When that happens, move the other voice parts down in contrary motion to that of the bass to the nearest chord tone. No chord tones are retained when you have the bass moving by a second. And finally, the 5 chord to the 6 chord. Let me read my note, double the third to avoid the A2. What does that mean? That means I'm going to find the parallel thirds that exist in the two voice parts in this 5 chord. From the bass up, B to a D sharp is the 10th or the third. That means I'm going to keep it in the same voice part and do a C up to a D, up to an E in the alto. There's my parallel tenths. Then I can complete the other voices. Why can't I put tenor on this G? Because then I'm creating parallel fifths, which is not allowed. So the tenors must go down to the E. And hopefully this makes sense. So I have a root, I've got 1/3, there's my other third, and there's my fifth that the sopranos can sing. Go back, double check that you have spelled the triad correctly and that you've doubled the root in most of these chords. And in the last chord, make sure you have doubled the third to avoid the augmented second interval. How is that avoided? Well, if I didn't follow that principle, then what happens is, it's very possible that the altos could sing a C, and then you'd have this augmented second interval, which is forbidden. So we can't have that. So I'll erase it. And there you have it. Let's move on to page 7, 13A. Irregular doubling should not occur in several chords in succession. Return immediately to normal doubling after a chord in which irregular doubling occurs. Write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. Irregular doubling will occur at the asterisks. Take care that doubled tones are left in contrary motion. Very important. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We need to supply the Roman numerals given the key of G major. Write the triads. This is a major 5. I have no figured bass to indicate that I need to raise anything. That's because I have a key signature. So it's D, F sharp, A. That's how I know it's major. Okay, so I figured out my triads. Now I've got to look at the motion of the bass. So the bass is moving up by the interval of a third. If at all possible, retain the common tones, which we can do here in the tenor. Altos can shift down right here. Why do you suppose there's irregular doubling here in the where the asterisk is? Well, because if you look carefully, we have one root and we have 2/3 that are doubled. Supposing I decided to put the soprano here, then it would be normal doubling. But since the given note was the D in the soprano, that's why we have irregular doubling there. So it does happen. Next, I have the 3 chord to the 2 chord. That means that the bass is moving by the interval of a second, which means I'll have no common tones. So tenors will have to sing a different note, the nearest chord tone, as will the altos and the sopranos. Now I've got a 2 chord to a 5 chord. That means the bass moves by that interval of a fourth. Notice that I can't keep and retain my A in the same voice. Okay? And that's simply because of the given soprano note is an A. So I can't have the altos singing an A also, because I don't want to double the fifth here. I still want to double the root. So that's why you see that we cannot retain the common tone in the same voice. That does happen also. And then I have the 5 chord to the 1 chord. The bass moves by the interval of a fifth. Here I can retain the common tone in the tenor voice and move the upper voices, the soprano and alto voices, to the nearest chord tone. Number 14, write the alto and tenor voices and supply the Roman numeral analysis. Irregular doubling will happen here. Notice my key of A major. Spell your triads. Notice your key signature. Be very mindful of that. Once you've done that, go back, identifying the motion of the bass. Interval moves by that of a third between chord 1 and 2. When that happens, retain 2 common tones in the same voice. I'm starting to probably sound like a broken record, but trust me, the more I say it, I think the more you'll get it ingrained inside your brain. And therefore, the root is doubled. From the chord 2 to chord 3, we have going from a minor 3 chord to a major 4 chord. The bass moves by an interval of a second, which means there's no common tones. If the bass is moving up by a step, move the other 3 voice parts in contrary motion to the bass. In this case, it would be down to the nearest chord tone. Then we have the 4 chord going to the 6 chord. The bass is moving by that interval of a third. Retain common tones if you can. You can certainly do that in the tenor voice. You cannot do it in the other voice. You can't retain the F sharp because of the soprano note that's written. In that particular case, you're going to have 1 root, 2/3, and a fifth. And that's acceptable. Going from the 5 chord, the minor 6 chord to the 5 chord, the bass is moving by the interval of a second. It's moving down. What does that mean? That means, if at all possible, move the other voices up in contrary motion to that of the bass. It's not possible in the case of the soprano because the soprano had irregular doubling in the previous chord. So you'll need to move the soprano down to the nearest chord tone, resulting in 2 roots, a fifth, and a third.